Was, let me just
Posso... Volevo fare...
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Yes.
if I understand your question, which I probably don't, can we do the same sort of research that I was talking about in Fragile X? And the answer is yes. And I think it was 6 months ago or so, there was a leak to the New York Times about a pharmacologic intervention in rats that's beneficial. I suspect, I don't have any insider knowledge, okay, but I suspect that it's rather similar to what they're doing with tuberous sclerosis. They have gotten enough information about what the gene does at a molecular level with those proteins that they found some sort of system molecularly that they can intervene with. And I think those trials are getting close to ending and being published.
Okay.
Posso fare una domanda?
Some question?
Vorrei parlare italiano, se possibile, che viene meglio.
Yes.
La domanda è riguardo il focus, diciamo, degli occhi dei ragazzi con autismo, sul discorso che non controllino gli occhi ma preferiscano piuttosto guardare la bocca. E mi chiedevo se c'è qualche approfondimento per capire il perché i ragazzi con autismo si concentrino sulla bocca piuttosto che sugli occhi, se è una questione che c'è un'attrazione particolare per quella parte, è più comprensibile, o se cioè, c'è un motivo per cui non vogliono vedere gli occhi. E l'altra domanda era, ho notato il discorso del Digimon, soprattutto il fatto che venisse attivata maggiormente il cervello nel momento in cui il ragazzo guardava un qualcosa a cui era legato affettivamente. Mi chiedevo se anche nel riconoscimento dei volti il legame affettivo possa avere un qualche valore, cioè se mostrando dei volti di persone conosciute o che comunque hanno un valore possa essere diverso il focus.
Yes, both very good questions. Let me try to answer them. First of all, in terms of the eyes and the gaze,
non c'è la traduzione.
We're not saying the children... No translation.
Adesso sì.
There is translation. Yes. Otherwise, my Italian... sangue, sangue. Right? So back to gaze. The question is a couple things. The first thing is, typical babies. I can remember holding my first child 3 minutes after she was born. And she is there and she is looking at me and I am looking at her and she's off and running. It's something that typical babies come into the world with. And again, that's what's so unusual, and that's what got Connor interested in autism. And again, I'm not judging the pros and cons of it, and I certainly wouldn't see it as something the child wills him or herself to do. But there's something very fundamental from very early on. And again, that sort of developmental aspect of it, even typical babies look at the top half of the face from fairly early on. I think my colleague Ami Klin this morning and possibly Kasia Havarska showed some developmental data. We have some lovely data now for a whole group of children followed from birth in terms of how this sort of develops and how children play the social game if they're typically developing and how it can go awry in autism. But let's assume for whatever reason the wiring that Dr. Minshew was talking about isn't there. And so then you have to basically go to what we would call Plan B in the States. And so you don't have that eye business to sort of guide you, what's the next thing? Well, you might look for other sources of meaning, one of which is there's a mouth moving all the time and sounds are coming out, that's just a guess. The other thing I realized is I simplified it a little bit because I was showing you the results from our first and our study of the more able people. Less able people are more disorganized in their looking. So they don't just look at mouths, they look at everything. And it sort of goes down, down, down. The more disabled you are, the more disorganized you are in terms of your visual strategies. And then, sorry, what was the second question again? something. Oh, expertise. Sorry. You were asking about, is it the thing the kid cares about? The big debate in the face processing world, and Dr. Minshew, who's a neurologist, can weigh in on this, is that fusiform face area, is it only a face area or is it an expertise area? And the reason I say that is if you're a watchmaker and you look at a watch, your fusiform gyrus lights up. If you're a dog person and you look at dogs, your fusiform gyrus lights up. So it seems to, I would argue that probably developmentally, it's first and foremost for most of us a face area. As time goes on, we use it because it's such an area of expertise, of visual expertise. It gets recruited to other purposes, other areas of expertise. And there's some studies showing that you can train things that the child has never seen before, make them an area of expertise for the child, and that will then elicit their fusiform gyrus. So it may be things that the child cares about. It may also be things the child's afraid of. It's not so simple as sort of loving it. And in fact, my experience is often the things that children with a more classical Asperger's model have, things that they learn a lot about, often it's because they were first afraid of something. And this is their way of mastering the fear. So it's a very interesting and complicated issue, but those are both very excellent questions.
I think
Ok, scusate, il tempo è scaduto. Comunque se c'è l'ultima domanda possiamo... L'ultima. E poi c'è il coffee break. Io devo far rispettare il tempo.
So let me ask Dr. Minshew.
yes.
Why was George Bush elected president twice?
The Brits say it's because we all have Asperger's.
Okay.
Last question.
They actually did. That was a headline.
I know.
L'ultima. Spiace.
Oh, gosh.
I wore them out with George Bush.
Un'ultima domanda. Gli altri le potete fare privatamente al dottor Fred e Nancy, saranno lieti di rispondere privatamente però. Allora, l'ultima domanda, per cortesia.
My question is very short, actually. It is to Dr. Minshew. My question is to Dr. Minshew.
You never know.
Would you recommend about mini-colon pathology in relation to your underconnectivity hypothesis?
What is he saying?
Dr. Minshew, my question is to you.
Yes. Sorry.
Yes.
Restate the question.
No, I'm speaking in English.
In inglese, sì. Ok.
But I still didn't understand.
Ok.
Oh my gosh.
No, vabbè, per la
Translate into Italian, then she'll
traduzione
respond.
simultanea, translation,
Yeah,
for
translate
translation. Ok. Allora, the question.
My question is to Dr. Minshew.
Yes, sir.
It's a short one. Would you please recommend on mini-colon pathology in relation to your underconnectivity hypothesis? Do you think that it is relevant or irrelevant to your hypothesis?
What did you say? I didn't understand.
Mini-colon pathology of Casanova.
Underconnectivity.
Yes, underconnectivity. I'm sorry, it's
The mini-columnar pathology as
Many columns.
mini-colon.
mini columns. Yes.
Mini
yes.
column.
Yes.
What's your feeling about it in relevance to your underconnectivity hypothesis?
It just went. Yes, I think many columns was an excellent observation and been replicated a number of times, and I think it's looking at the same sort of thing that I'm talking about. I think one of the issues that, well, the first thing is we're still looking at what's altered in the brain or different from about 10,000 miles away, so we're not beginning to be down to the level of detail that we need to be to really talk intelligently about the basis of underconnectivity, for example. But the question that I think about really at the moment is it that there's simply underdevelopment of connections among association cortex areas, cortical areas? You know, is it the old long distance connections are underdeveloped, in which case that would predict interhemispheric connections would be abnormal, and I'm not sure that's true. And the reason it's important is because there's certain cell types that project across the corpus callosum and others don't. So, but I wonder about, does everybody that we see with autism who's high functioning, so we know what they're thinking, do they all have an enhanced memory for detail? In other words, is there at least clinical evidence that local connectivity is increased? No. There's some even among the verbal ones that don't have that. So the next question becomes whether there's variation right there in that there is some form of development where some end up with that enhanced local connectivity and enhanced visual memory or auditory memory or whatever sort of savant-like skill, and their long-distance connections don't develop. But then there's others where I don't think there is the enhanced local connectivity, and yet they have the evidence of less connectivity with frontal lobe. But then I look at the high-functioning people. I'm just saying there's not an answer to this. There's only more questions. Is they're very good at some types of reasoning that we would associate with the frontal lobes, like rule learning. Nobody knows the rules better than they know the rules. And of course, they'll tell you when you break one. But the other part of that is that because they have some local connections in the frontal lobe, or is that because they have a sort of an immaturity, underdevelopment of the connectivity, so that do we see in little children that they can kind of put things in basic categories that follow rules? Or do they also have the parallel capacity to create a relationship that they weren't told by a rule? I don't know if that's very clear, but I think that's about as good as we're getting with connectivity. But I do look at that picture of the two neurons and the differences in what the genes impact. Is it axonal outgrowth, axonal pathfinding, synaptic function? And I think there must be differences. There are probably differences that we can detect, but we haven't thought about how to find those. What would they look like if you have a disorder of axonal pathfinding? So that's the long answer, which means I don't really have an answer.
Ok. E io ringrazio tantissimo, capisci l'italiano? Ringrazio tantissimo Nancy e Fred perché veramente hanno arricchito questo congresso con la loro partecipazione, hanno proposto questo puzzle che io spero che in un prossimo futuro puzzle verrà chiarito, composto, credo con la partecipazione di tutti. Più gente ci lavorerà, più la clinica darà una contribuzione importante alla ricerca. Io ringrazio voi per la vostra attenzione, per la vostra attiva partecipazione, ma do veramente un caro abbraccio, abbraccio a questi relatori che veramente ci hanno dato dei dati scientifici importantissimi. Grazie Fred, grazie Nancy.